Elias Voss, 23, apothecary's apprentice of the river town of Lindenau, had exactly one talent that mattered tonight. He could fold himself into small spaces without making a sound. He'd learned it hiding from his master's temper. He had not expected to need it hiding from an amorous baron in the castle of Drachenholt. "There you are, little herb boy." The baron's voice slurred from the corridor, entirely too close. Elias did not stop to consider dignity. He wrenched open the nearest door, found a wardrobe instead of an exit, and posted himself inside it between a fur mantle and something that smelled, absurdly, of pine and thunderstorms. The door swung open a second time, not the baron's doing. A shape unfolded from the shadows of the room itself, tall enough that Elias's first thought was this room was already occupied, and his second thought arrived with considerably more alarm. Silver-white hair, eyes the pale gold of a wolf's, catching the one candle in the room like a coin catching sunlight. He wore the black and silver of the royal house loosely, like a man who found ceremony tiresome, and he was looking at Elias, currently folded between two coats, with a sprig of dried lavender stuck to his collar, with an expression that hovered dangerously between offense and delight. This was, Elias understood with the sinking clarity of a man watching his own execution approach politely, King James of the White Wolf Line, 26, Alpha of Drachenholt, the man whose betrothal negotiations had brought half the apothecary guild, Elias included, north to supply the wedding feast's remedies. "I can explain," Elias said, which was a lie because he could not. "Please do." The king folded his arms and leaned against the doorframe, entirely too entertained. "I've had a remarkably dull evening. A man hiding in my wardrobe is the first interesting thing that's happened since the soup course. There's a baron in your hallway who's had 4 cups of your excellent wine and has decided I'm dessert." Something flickered across the king's face. Not laughter, not yet, but the effort of suppressing it. "Baron Kessler. I didn't ask his name before I ran." Wise. He extended a hand, an absurdly formal gesture toward a boy standing in a wardrobe with lavender in his hair. "Come out before you suffocate on my coats." "Herb boy." "Elias," Elias said, taking the offered hand out of sheer reflexive manners, and instantly regretting how it made his pulse do something stupid and immediate, like a struck bell. "Elias Voss, James," as if that clarified anything, as if the whole castle didn't already whisper that name like a prayer or a warning. His grip was warm, and he did not let go quite as quickly as courtesy required, "though I imagine you already had a name for me before tonight." "The White Wolf King," Elias admitted. Also, several less flattering things, from the guildmaster who does not appreciate being summoned north on 4 days' notice. That earned him the laugh he'd been half hoping for. Lo, surprised out of the king like Elias had startled it loose. "I'll pass along my apologies to your guildmaster," assuming, and here his gold eyes went warm in a way that made the room feel smaller. "You don't intend to spend the whole visit hiding in furniture." "I make no promises," Elias said, extracting the lavender from his collar, with as much dignity as he could gather, "where barons are concerned." He did not know, as he slipped from that room with his heart going like a rabbit's, that he had just met the man who would break it in 9 days, and that the king, watching him go with an expression no one in that castle had seen on him in 3 years, had just met the man who would put it back together. 9 days is not very long to fall for someone. It is, however, precisely long enough when the someone in question keeps finding excuses to visit the apothecary's workroom. James came for headache remedies he did not have headaches for. He came to ask about a cough that never once produced a cough. He came on the 6th day, with no excuse at all, and simply sat on the workbench swinging his boots like a boy half his age, while Elias ground dried yarrow and pretended not to be aware of every inch of the king's attention. "You're going to ruin that mortar," Elias said, glaring at it like it insulted your mother. "I'm not glaring at the mortar. You're glaring at something." "I'm glaring," James said, with the particular gravity of a man delivering a confession, "at the fact that I have 4 days left before my council expects an answer on this alliance marriage, and I have spent all 9 of the days I did have thinking about apothecary hands instead of state matters." Elias's grinding slowed to a stop. Outside the workroom window, the bells of Lindenau's chapel counted out the hour, slow and golden, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the ribs. "That's a poor use of a king's attention," Elias managed. "Probably," James agreed, and did not look sorry. It was the closest either of them had come to naming the thing that had grown up between them like ivy on old stone. Quiet, tenacious, present in every shared laugh over the guildmaster's complaints, every time James's hand found some excuse to brush Elias's while accepting a tincture, every evening walk along the river that ran 2 hours longer than either of them intended. Which was precisely why, 3 nights later, hidden by accident behind the same tapestry he'd once used to escape Baron Kessler, Elias heard the words that stopped his heart cold in his chest. The boy from the apothecary, the king's mother, Dowager Queen Astrid, was saying, sharp and low in the small council chamber, "You cannot possibly mean to entangle the crown with a commoner during Alliance Week, James." "I don't intend to entangle the crown with him," came James's voice, flat in a way Elias had never heard from him. "I intend to use him." The words landed like stones dropped down a well. Elias heard them, and then heard the silence after them, worse than the words themselves. "He's clever, well-liked by the visiting guildmasters, and Kessler's already sniffing around him," James went on, each sentence a nail. "If I'm seen courting him publicly, Kessler backs off the herb trade concessions he's been pressing for, and the Alliance Council stops asking why I've delayed the betrothal announcement. It's a useful distraction. Once the treaty's signed, it ends, cleanly, before he expects anything more from it." Elias did not remember deciding to run. He remembered the tapestry's rough weave against his palm, and then the cold of the corridor, and then nothing at all, until he was 3 streets from the castle gates with the taste of iron in his mouth from biting back something that wanted very badly to be a sob. Use him, cleanly, before he expects anything more. He did not go back to the apothecary's quarters. He packed nothing but the small clay jar of yarrow salve he'd made with his own hands. Foolish, sentimental, he'd think later, and by the time Lindno's bells rang for dawn, Elias Voss was 3 villages gone, and the White Wolf King's chambers held nothing of him but a folded apron and a smell already fading from the wardrobe. James did not sleep. This was not new. Kings rarely do the week before a treaty, but this particular sleeplessness had teeth in it, a restlessness that made his wolf pace behind his ribs like something caged. He found the apron first, then the empty cot. Then, from a kitchen girl too frightened of royal fury to lie, the direction of the North Road. He heard something, was all the girl would say, twisting her apron. "Whatever it was, Your Grace," it left him white as a sheet and running before the second bell. James went very still. Then, with the particular calm of a man doing frantic arithmetic in his head, he began listing every conversation of the last 3 days that a hidden man might have overheard and misunderstood catastrophically. It took him until the stable yard to land on the right one. It took him considerably longer to forgive himself for it. "You're an idiot," said Sir Conrad Bellamy, 29, captain of the King's Guard, and the only man alive permitted to say so to his face, watching James saddle his own horse with more violence than the task required. "You gave a political strategy speech about the man you're courting in a room with tapestries you know don't reach the floor." "Thank you, Conrad, immensely helpful. I'm only saying, if you'd told your mother the truth instead of dressing it up as strategy. My mother thinks with her ledgers, not her heart. If I'd told her I meant to marry an apothecary's apprentice out of nothing but feeling, she'd have had the betrothal council convened by breakfast." James swung up onto his horse, jaw tight. "I was protecting him from exactly the scrutiny he's now run headlong into anyway." "Beautifully done, James. Truly masterful. So we're riding after him." "We are riding after him. In the rain." James looked up. It had indeed begun to rain, in the theatrical way that seemed determined to underscore his poor decisions. "Yes, Conrad. In the rain." Conrad sighed the sigh of a man who had signed up to guard a king and ended up chaperoning a romance. "For what it's worth," he added, mounting his own horse. "Kessler's been asking after the apothecary boy too, if we don't find him first." "We will find him first," James said, and there was enough wolf in his voice that Conrad decided, wisely, to say nothing further, and simply spurred his horse to keep pace. Elias found work 3 days later in St. Oran, a market town tucked against the foothills where the river split into 2 lazy arms, in the shop of a herbalist widow who asked no questions about a young man with red eyes and steady hands. He told himself he was fine. He told the widow's cat the same thing, rather more often than was reasonable, while it watched him crush chamomile with unnecessary force. He was not fine on the 4th day, when a familiar white-furred shape trotted into the market square in broad daylight, causing every stall-keeper to drop what they were holding, and resolved itself, mid-stride, with the particular shimmer of a shift no fully human eye should have been fast enough to catch, into King James, dust-streaked, road-worn, and looking at Elias across 2 rows of vegetable stalls, like a man who had crossed a kingdom to get there, which, Elias reflected with a lurch of something that was not quite anger and not quite relief he had. "You," Elias said, backing behind the pickle barrels with the same instinct that had once sent him into a wardrobe, "are supposed to be negotiating a treaty." "The treaty," James said, advancing with the patience of a man who had chased this particular hare before, and knew better than to spook it further, "can wait. You cannot, apparently, because you keep leaving kingdoms before I can catch up. I heard you." The words came out sharper than Elias intended, sharper than he'd meant to let them. But 3 days of practicing this exact confrontation in his head had worn away any softness. "In the council chamber, use him. Cleanly. I'm not." His voice cracked on the word, infuriatingly. "I'm not a herb trade concession, James." Understanding broke across James's face like dawn breaking wrong way over a hill, visibly, painfully, all at once. "Elias, don't. I was talking about the courtship being public," James said, low and urgent, closing the last of the distance despite the pickle barrels, despite the market crowd now openly staring, despite everything. "Not about you. Never about you. I told my mother a lie about strategy, because the truth, that I'd fallen for an apothecary's apprentice 9 days into knowing him, hopelessly, past all sense, was going to get you dragged in front of the whole Alliance Council, and picked apart before either of us had decided what we wanted this to be. I was trying to buy us time, Elias. I did it badly. I did it like a coward, honestly, and I am sorrier for that than I've been for anything in longer than I can say." The market square had gone very quiet, in the specific way market squares do when they've decided something more interesting than commerce is happening. "You said once the treaty's signed, it ends," Elias said, but the anger in it had gone thin, run through with something more fragile. "Because I meant the lie would end," James said. "The pretense, not," he exhaled, and for the first time since Elias had known him, the White Wolf King looked genuinely, helplessly uncertain. "Not you. I don't want you to end, Elias. I came here on foot for 4 days and shifted through a border checkpoint I am absolutely going to hear about from Conrad for the rest of my natural life, because the idea of you ending was the worst thing I could imagine." Somewhere behind him, Conrad, arriving at last, mud to his knees, leading 2 exhausted horses, muttered, "For the record, I did mention the checkpoint, to no one in particular." Elias looked at the King of Drakenholt, standing in a pickled vegetable market with dust in his silver hair and his heart, evidently entirely undefended on his sleeve, and felt the anger that had carried him 3 villages north finally, quietly run out of road. "You're an idiot," he said, echoing Conrad without knowing it. "Established fact," James agreed. "Am I your idiot, though? That's the part I came all this way to ask. Trust, once cracked, does not mend in a single market square confession, however lovely." Elias knew this the way he knew which herbs closed a wound too fast and left the poison trapped beneath. Some things needed to heal slow, from the inside out, or they festered. So he did not simply climb onto James's horse and ride back to Drakenholt as though 9 days and 1 devastating misunderstanding hadn't happened. He made James wait a full day in Sankt Oren, ostensibly to finish an order of salves for the widow, actually to watch, really watch, whether the king's patience matched his words. It did. James spent the day carrying water for the widow's shop without being asked, badly bandaging his own thumb after an argument with a stubborn root vegetable, and somehow charming the widow's cat into a devotion Elias himself had never managed in 4 days of trying. "That animal has never once sat on my lap," Elias informed him that evening, watching the cat loaf contentedly across the king's knees like it had found its rightful throne. "Some of us have a way with difficult creatures," James said, entirely too pleased with himself. "Are you calling me difficult?" "I'm calling you worth the trouble," James said, and the teasing dropped out of his voice enough that Elias's breath caught. "There's a difference, and I intend to spend considerably more time proving I know it." It was on the walk back from the widow's shop, under a sky gone the deep bruised purple of early evening, that James's hand finally found Elias's. Not the accidental brush of the workroom days, but deliberate fingers lacing through his with a question in the grip that Elias answered by not letting go. "I'm going to tell my mother the truth this time," James said. "All of it." That I want to court you properly, publicly, with no strategy attached to it but the plain fact that I can't stop thinking about you. She'll object. She will object magnificently, James agreed. She has opinions about everything, my mother, most of them loud. But I'd rather have a loud, honest fight than another quiet, clever lie. I learned that lesson rather expensively this week. Elias laughed, the first real laugh since the tapestry, since the running, and it seemed to loosen something in James's shoulders that had been wound tight since Linda now. There's still Kessler, Elias said, sobering. You said he was asking after me. There's still Kessler, James agreed, and something colder moved behind his gold eyes. But that's a problem for a king to solve, not a boy to run from. Let me handle him, properly this time. No hiding you behind cover stories. Baron Kessler, it transpired, had never much cared about Elias at all. The apothecary boy was, and had only ever been, a lever. What Kessler wanted was the herb trade concessions James had been dangling before him for months, and when word reached him that the king had ridden off half the kingdom chasing a runaway apprentice, he saw his opening and seized it with both greedy hands. A scandal, Kessler announced to the returning Alliance Council. 3 days later, once James and Elias had ridden back into Drakenholt to a castle already buzzing with rumor, cannot be permitted to taint this treaty. The Alpha King abandoning negotiations to chase a commoner across 4 villages. The visiting delegations will read weakness into it, unless, of course, the herb concessions were quietly signed over to smooth matters. A gesture of good faith to reassure our guests that the crown remains focused. That, said Elias, before James could open his mouth, standing in a council chamber he had absolutely not been invited to and did not care in the slightest, is the single worst attempt at blackmail I have ever witnessed, and I once watched a drunk baron try to bribe my master with a chicken. The chamber went silent. Dowager Queen Astrid, seated at the head of the table with her sharp assessing eyes, made a sound that might, in a woman of less dignity, have been a snort. You have something to add, apothecary? Kessler said, reddening. Only that you've mistaken love for leverage, my lord, which tells me everything about how well you'd have handled the herb trade. Elias's voice did not shake, though his hands, hidden in his sleeves, very much did. The king rode after me because he cares for me. That's not a scandal. That's simply a man doing what any of you would hope someone would do for you, if you were foolish enough to run from something good out of fear. James, watching from beside the council table, felt something in his chest go warm and fierce, and entirely too fond to be appropriate for a formal proceeding. The concessions stay as originally negotiated, in full, with no adjustment, he said, before Kessler could recover his footing. And Baron Kessler, you'll find that threatening the man I intend to court, in front of my council, in front of my mother, was not the masterstroke you believed it to be. Intend to court? Astrid repeated, one eyebrow arching toward her hairline. Openly, James said, publicly. No strategy attached, mother, beyond the plain truth that I love him. You may object as loudly as you like. I'd rather hear it than lie to you again. The silence that followed had an entirely different quality than the one Kessler had engineered. The hush of a room recalibrating around an unmistakable, undeniable truth. Astrid studied her son for a long moment, then turned that same sharp gaze on Elias, who did not flinch from it, though his heart was going like a drum. He argues well, she said finally, to no one in particular. That, at least, is useful in a consort. Kessler, get out of my sight before I reconsider your usefulness entirely. Winter came to Drakenholt gently that year, dusting the castle towers in a soft that made the whole city look painted. Elias, granted rooms far too grand for an apothecary's apprentice, and rather charmingly unable to stop apologizing to the servants for it, had settled into something like belonging, helping the castle physician stock the winter remedies, teasing James mercilessly whenever he tried and failed to sneak into the workroom unannounced, and slowly, carefully, letting the last guarded corners of his heart unclench. It was on the winter solstice, with the castle hall strung in fir boughs and candlelight, that James found him at the window of the same small workroom where this had all started, watching the first snow settle over the river. I have something for you, James said, and I should warn you, Conrad thinks it's excessive, my mother thinks it's overdue, and I think both of them can mind their own affairs. He held out, not a ring, not yet, though Elias would learn later that one waited, carefully hidden, for a spring proposal James had been planning since St. Oran, but a small clay jar, unmistakably the twin of the one Elias had carried out of Lindenau on the worst night of his life. "I had the castle glassblower copy it," James said. "From the one you left behind. I kept the original. I couldn't." He stopped, and there was something unguarded in his face that no council chamber, no treaty negotiation had ever seen. "I kept it on my nightstand for 9 days while you were gone, Elias. It smelled like yarrow and like you, and it was the only thing in that whole castle that felt like it hadn't left." Elias took the jar with hands that were not quite steady and did not trust his voice for a long moment. "I ran because I loved you already," he said finally, "and it terrified me how much that overheard sentence hurt. If it hadn't mattered, I wouldn't have run 3 villages before breakfast." "I know," James said softly. "I worked that out somewhere around village 2, chasing you in the rain. You could have just said all this instead of a jar." "I could have," James agreed, and the familiar teasing warmth crept back into his eyes, chasing off the rare vulnerable quiet. "But I've learned this year that showing you tends to work better than telling you. So, show, don't simply tell." He took Elias's face gently between both hands, warm despite the winter chill in the workroom, careful in a way that made Elias's breath catch. "I love you, not as strategy, not as cover, not as anything but the plain, undignified, thoroughly unstrategic truth. I have loved you since a boy in my wardrobe told me he made no promises where barons were concerned, and I would like, very much, to spend the considerable remainder of my life finding out what other promises you're willing to make." The kiss that followed was slow and certain, warmed by candlelight and for-scented air, and outside the workroom window the first snow of winter kept falling over Drakenholt like the whole sky had decided, at last, to agree with them. They were married the following spring, not in the grand cathedral of Drakenholt that Astrid had lobbied for, but on the old stone bridge at Lindenau, where an apothecary's apprentice had once ground yarrow, while pretending not to notice a king finding excuses to visit. "It's terribly unconventional," Astrid said, watching the river town preparations with the air of a woman who had, against all odds, come around entirely, "marrying on a bridge like a pair of fishwives." "He proposed to me over a mortar and pestle, your grace," Elias said, adjusting the sprig of yarrow tucked deliberately into his wedding sash. "A bridge is practically formal by our standards." The whole town turned out. The guildmaster, who'd once complained about being summoned north, now weeping openly into a handkerchief. The widow from Sankt Oren, who'd traveled 2 days with her cat in a basket and refused, on principle, to leave it behind. Conrad, standing as James's second, muttering something about checkpoints that made the king laugh mid-vow, and earned him a mild swat from his very soon-to-be husband. When James finally slid the ring onto Elias's hand, a plain silver band, deliberately unshowy, chosen specifically because Elias had once said grand things made him nervous. The whole bridge erupted, and somewhere in the crowd, the widow's cat, perched imperiously on Conrad's shoulder, let out a long, satisfied meow, as though it, too, had been waiting 9 days and one very long chase to see this exact ending arrive. 2 years married, and the White Wolf King of Drakenholt was, at present, losing an argument with a cabbage. "It's a root vegetable," Elias said from the workroom doorway, arms folded, watching his husband wrestle a stubborn winter cabbage that had rolled under the workbench for the 3rd time that morning. "You've faced down Baron Kessler, 3 border disputes, and my mother-in-law's dinner parties. The cabbage is undefeated." "The cabbage," James said, with the deep offended dignity of a man who ruled a kingdom and could not apparently retrieve produce, "is possessed. It's a cabbage, James. It's personal now." Elias laughed, the easy, unguarded laugh of a man who had stopped, long ago, expecting the ground to shift beneath good things, and crouched down to retrieve the wretched vegetable himself, handing it over with the smug satisfaction of a husband who would never, ever let this go. "You're doing that thing," James said, accepting the cabbage with as much grace as he could muster, "where you look far too pleased with my failures." "I'm doing the thing," Elias agreed, "where I've been married to you for 2 years and I've discovered you're absolutely hopeless at exactly one domestic task, and I intend to enjoy it for the rest of our natural lives." "There was a second task," James said, "involving a very stubborn wardrobe door 3 years ago that I recall handling rather well. You found a boy hiding in your coats and asked no follow-up questions about the lavender. That's not handling it. That's a very low bar. It was the best decision of my reign. Better than the treaty?" "Considerably better than the treaty," James said, setting the cabbage aside. Permanently, decisively, a war conceded, and pulling Elias in by the waist with the easy familiarity of 2 years of ordinary Tuesdays. The treaty gave us herb trade concessions. The wardrobe gave me you. I know which one my mother still brings up at every dinner party, and it is, disappointingly for her ledgers, not the treaty. Outside, the river ran past Drakenholt, exactly as it had the day a king first followed an apothecary's apprentice north into the rain, and inside, in a workroom that smelled of yarrow, and faintly of pine and thunderstorms, the White Wolf King kissed his husband slowly, unhurried, with the whole rest of an ordinary, extraordinary life stretching out ahead of them like an open road. The cabbage, for what it's worth, was never spoken of again. 3 years into their marriage, Drakenholt had grown thoroughly used to the sight of its king doing undignified things for love, chasing runaway cabbages across the workroom floor, losing arguments to his husband in front of the entire kitchen staff, humming old Rivertown tunes under his breath, while he signed decrees instead of issuing them with the gravity his mother still insisted a monarch ought to carry. So when James appeared in the workroom doorway one autumn evening, looking uncharacteristically serious, Elias set down his mortar at once, because a serious James was rarer by then than snow in July. "You're doing the face," Elias said, already reaching for a cloth to wipe the yarrow dust from his hands, some old instinct telling him this was not a conversation to have with sticky fingers. "The one you did before you told me the whole kingdom knew about the wardrobe incident." "It's not that dramatic." James came to lean against the workbench, close enough that his shoulder pressed warm against Elias's, close enough that Elias could smell the cold evening air still clinging to his cloak. Wood smoke, damp wool, and underneath it, the particular scent that had never quite left James in 3 years of marriage, pine and something like distant thunder. Outside the window, the last gold light of evening lay long across the river, the same river that had once carried a runaway apothecary 3 villages north and a heartbroken king close behind him, and for a moment James simply watched it, gathering whatever it was he'd come to say. "I was in the lower town today," he continued finally, "settling a dispute over grain storage, deeply unglamorous, you'd have hated every minute of it. 3 merchants shouting about spoiled barley for the better part of an hour. I'm aware of your schedule, James. I helped you prepare the notes for it. You underlined the word barley 4 separate times, which I found excessive even by your standards." That earned him a small, distracted smile, gone as quickly as it came. "There was a boy," James said, and something in his voice softened in a way that made Elias go very still, set the cloth down entirely, and give his husband his full attention, watching from the alley behind the grain hall. 7 years old, maybe 8. Hard to say for certain. He's thin in a way that made my chest hurt just to look at him. When the guards moved to clear the street for my carriage, the way they always do, he didn't run like the other children scatter. He just stood there and watched me go by, very still, like he was trying to memorize something he expected never to see again." Elias's hands had gone quiet over the workbench. "One of the grain merchants told me afterward," James went on, quieter now, "that he's been sleeping in the hall's storage shed since his mother died of fever last winter. No father listed anywhere in the parish rolls, no family left in the town to claim him. The merchant said, the boy comes round for scraps some evenings, and disappears the rest, and everyone's simply gotten used to it, the way you get used to a stray cat you feed, but never quite bring indoors." Elias knew, without needing to ask, exactly where this conversation was heading, because he had been quietly turning over the same unspoken thought himself for the better part of a year now, in the 2 large, 2 quiet rooms of their wing of the castle, built for a family that had somehow never quite arrived, in the specific ache that came from watching Conrad's own small daughter toddle unsteadily through the great hall on feast days, while James watched her with an expression he thought he was hiding well, and was not hiding at all. "You want to bring him home," Elias said softly. "Not a question." "I want to ask you if we want to bring him home," James corrected, taking Elias's hand, ink-stained on James's part from an afternoon of decrees, yarrow-scented on Elias's from an afternoon of tinctures, and holding it between both of his own with a careful gravity Elias had only seen him use for treaty signings and marriage vows. "I won't decide this alone, not this. Out of every decision I've made as king, this is the one I refuse to make like a king instead of a husband." Elias looked down at their joined hands, the the plain silver band on his own finger, the matching one on James's, 3 years of small, ordinary miracles built out of one wardrobe and one cabbage and one bridge wedding, and felt something in his chest crack open, warm and frightened and entirely certain, all at the same time. "Bring him home," Elias said, and his voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected. "Bring him home tonight, James, before that shed gets any colder. We'll work out the rest of it together, the way we do everything." James did not wait for morning. He rode back down into the lower town himself, alone but for Conrad trailing a careful, respectful distance behind, and found the boy exactly where the merchant had said he would be, curled into a nest of old grain sacks in the corner of the storage shed, knees drawn to his chest, flinching hard at the sound of the door. His name, they would learn only once he trusted them enough to offer it, was Peter, 7 years old, sharp-eyed and thin-shouldered and suspicious in the particular, brittle way of children who have already learned that kindness, in his experience, tended to arrive with a price attached somewhere further down the line. He did not speak, that first night, beyond a single wary "why" when James knelt down in the straw and offered him a hand up. He did not speak the whole ride back to the castle, pressed rigid and silent against James's chest under the king's own cloak, though Elias, waiting at the gate with a lantern and a blanket warmed by the kitchen fire, would swear afterward that he'd felt the boy's grip tighten reflexively around a fistful of James's shirt, somewhere around the 2nd mile, the way a drowning man grips driftwood without quite deciding to. He did not speak for the first 3 days in the castle at all. He did, however, eat. Peter ate with the single-minded, watchful focus of a boy who had gone hungry often enough that some old animal part of him no longer trusted food to still be there tomorrow, cleaning his plate with a thoroughness that made the kitchen staff exchange glances over his bowed head, hoarding a heel of bread in his sleeve at every meal, despite gentle assurances that there would always be more, watching the doorway between bites like he expected someone to arrive and take it all away. On the 4th evening, Elias found him, not at the dinner table, where he'd been served a perfectly reasonable meal not an hour before, and had, as always, eaten every bite of it without a word, but crouched behind the very same workbench where James had once lost an epic and thoroughly public battle with a cabbage. Systematically working his way through an entire raw one like it was the finest delicacy in the kingdom, cheeks bulging, small hands white-knuckled around it as though someone might wrestle it away. "That's not going to taste very good," Elias said gently, and instead of looming over the boy the way an adult so easily could, he lowered himself down onto the workroom floor to Peter's own level, close enough to speak softly, far enough not to crowd. Peter froze mid-bite, cabbage half-raised, eyes gone wide and glassy with the particular terror of a child caught stealing and already bracing, shoulders hunched, for the blow he expected to follow. "I'm not angry," Elias added quickly, keeping his voice low, and even the same voice he used for frightened animals brought into the apothecary, with wounds too fresh to trust a stranger's hands. "I'm only telling you, as someone who has personally watched the King of Drakenholt lose a war to that exact vegetable in front of the whole kitchen staff, that it tastes considerably better cooked." "Would you like to see how?" Peter did not answer. But he did not run either, and when Elias rose slowly and crossed to the small kitchen brazier kept in the workroom for warming tinctures, the boy's eyes followed him the whole way, wary and unblinking, the cabbage still clutched defensively to his chest. Elias talked while he worked, not to Peter directly, not yet, simply narrating the small, unthreatening business of chopping and heating, the way he might narrate a remedy to a patient too frightened to be addressed head-on. "This is butter. It's not much, but it makes everything better. This is a pinch of salt," my old master used to say. Salt was the difference between food and punishment. "This will take a few minutes. There's no hurry. You can watch from wherever you feel safest." By the time the cooked cabbage was ready, Peter had crept, by degrees so small they were nearly imperceptible, close enough to the brazier to see over the pot's rim. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything at all. But he ate the whole bowl, slower this time, without the hunted look of a boy guarding against theft, and when he finally curled up to sleep that night in the small adjoining room James had quietly ordered prepared, a proper bed, a proper blanket, a single unlit candle left within easy reach because a serving girl had mentioned, in passing, that the boy seemed to fear the dark, he left the empty bowl, washed and dried, sitting with careful precision just outside the workroom door, as though returning it properly might earn him the right to ask for more tomorrow. It took another full week before Peter would let James carry him up the stairs at bedtime, instead of insisting, jaw set with a stubbornness far too old for his years, that he could manage the climb himself despite legs gone shaky with exhaustion. It took a month before he stopped flinching, full-bodied and involuntary, whenever either man raised a hand for any reason at all, to brush hair from his eyes, to reach for a dish, to simply gesture mid-sentence. It took considerably longer than that before the word papa, tried out once, quietly, almost accidentally, aimed at James across the breakfast table on an otherwise unremarkable morning, didn't leave both grown men suspiciously misty-eyed over their porridge, clearing their throats and pretending, badly, to be absorbed in the weather. But it happened. Slowly, the way real healing does, not the neat sudden mending of a fairy tale, but the patient, unglamorous work of two men who had once fought their own way back from a devastating misunderstanding across 3 villages of rain-soaked road, and who understood, better than most, that trust rebuilt slowly was trust built to actually last. James took to it with a kind of quiet, deliberate patience that surprised even Elias, who had, after all, married the man and thought he knew every shape his devotion could take. He learned to lower himself onto the floor rather than tower over small shoulders. He learned to ask before touching, every time, without exception, until asking became habit rather than performance. He learned, on one particularly difficult evening, when Peter woke screaming from a dream he wouldn't describe, to simply sit outside the boy's door all night rather than push his way in, murmuring old Rivertown lullabies through the crack until the small, ragged breathing on the other side finally evened out into sleep. "He asked me today," James told Elias one night, voice low with a wonder that hadn't dimmed in months, whether wolves dream. I told him I would have to ask mine, since I only borrow the shape rather than living in it full time. He didn't run when I said it. Didn't even blink, actually. He just considered it very seriously, the way he considers everything, and said, and I quote, "Good, ask him if he dreams about cabbages, because I have a theory." "That's my son," Elias said, delighted, laughter catching in his throat in a way that felt suspiciously close to tears. "Already a menace, and he's barely said 40 words to either of us." "Our son," James corrected, soft and entirely certain, the words settling into the room like something already true, already old, already the shape their whole family had been quietly building toward. And Elias, apothecary's apprentice, castle physician's assistant, the man who had once run 3 villages north rather than trust a good thing to stay good, did not correct him back. It happened, as these things so often do, entirely by accident, on an unremarkable Tuesday roughly 4 months after Peter had come to live in the castle. James had been crossing the courtyard with an armful of firewood, distracted by an argument he was steadily losing. Again, to Conrad about the winter border patrol schedules, gesturing with his free hand in a way that scattered half his logs even before the ice took him. His boot caught the patch of black ice hidden beneath a thin dusting of frost, and in the graceless, flailing scramble to catch himself, he lost enough control of his composure that the shift happened before he'd consciously decided to let it. The old wolf instinct, older than any king's dignity, choosing safety over pride in the space of half a heartbeat. One moment, a king, mid-argument, arms full of firewood, dignity fully intact. The next, a very large white wolf, buried under a scattered pile of logs, looking deeply undignified and thoroughly betrayed by the basic laws of physics. Peter, who had been sitting on the courtyard steps supposedly practicing his letters under the kitchen girl's supervision, dropped his slate with a clatter that rang off the stone. Elias's heart, watching from the workroom window above, stopped entirely. 4 months of careful, patient trust-building, 4 months of asking before touching and sitting outside doors and cooked cabbage offered slowly, silently, without demand. And here it was, about to be undone in an instant by an icy cobblestone and appalling timing. Peter had never once seen the shift, had never been told, in so many words, precisely what kind of creature shared his new home. He had every reason in the world to bolt, screaming, back into the same terrified silence he'd first arrived in. Instead, Peter's face split into the widest grin either man had ever seen on him. "You're enormous," Peter breathed, already scrambling down off the steps and crossing the courtyard at a dead run, entirely without fear, straight toward 8 feet of very startled, very snow-white wolf tangled in firewood. Papa Elias. Papa Elias, come look, he's enormous. Why didn't anyone tell me my papa turns into the biggest dog in the whole kingdom? Wolf, Elias corrected weakly, arriving at the courtyard door, still catching up to the fact that his son had just run toward a shifted alpha king rather than away from one. Not a dog, Peter, a wolf. There's a meaningful difference, and James will absolutely lecture you about it at length once he remembers how to form words again. Wolf James, tangled in scattered firewood, tail already betraying him with an undignified, unmistakably delighted thump against the cobblestones, allowed a small boy who 4 months ago would not permit anyone to so much as touch his shoulder to fling both arms around his enormous furry neck without a single trace of hesitation, burying his whole face in white fur with a fierce, unguarded joy that made Elias's throat go tight. "Can you do it on purpose?" Peter demanded, muffled entirely against fur. "Can I ride you? Does it hurt when it happens?" "Can Marta from the kitchen see too? She won't believe me otherwise." It took the better part of an hour, once James had finally shifted back, sheepish, firewood scattered, thoroughly and happily conquered by a 7-year-old's enthusiasm, to answer even half of Peter's rapid-fire questions, and considerably longer for Conrad to stop laughing about the entire Border Patrol argument, being abandoned mid-sentence in favor of, as he put it to anyone who'd listen for the following month, the day the king lost a fight to an icy cobblestone in front of his own son, and gained a permanent nickname for it. He wasn't afraid, James said that night, still faintly stunned, standing in the doorway of Peter's room, watching the boy sleep with the particular fierce softness of a father discovering his own heart had grown 3 sizes without asking permission first. Not for a second, Elias. He just thought it was wonderful. Children are more sensible than adults about the things that actually matter, Elias said, leaning into James's side, resting his head against his husband's shoulder. It only took him 4 months to feel safe enough here to believe that something enormous and different could still be good. I'd say that's rather the whole shape of our story too, wouldn't you? A wardrobe, a wolf, a boy who ran 3 villages north rather than trust it. Turns out the frightening things were the safe ones all along. That's disgustingly poetic for a man who once threw pickle barrels at me. I did not throw pickle barrels at you, I merely hid behind them. There's a meaningful difference, as I recall someone once explaining to a 7-year-old about wolves and dogs. James laughed, quiet, warm, entirely undefended, and pulled Elias close in the doorway of their son's room, and for a long moment neither of them said anything further at all, simply listening to the small, even sound of a boy sleeping soundly, without nightmares, for the first time in longer than either of them could count. Marta arrived the following spring, not through tragedy this time, but through simple, stubborn, thoroughly premeditated persistence. She was the kitchen girl's niece, 6 years old, whip-smart and utterly, magnificently unimpressed by royalty, in a way that had already made her something of a legend below stairs. She had taken to visiting Peter twice a week, ever since he'd been settled enough to have visitors at all, the 2 of them forming the kind of immediate, uncomplicated friendship children manage far more easily than adults. And over several months of these visits, Marta had, quietly, methodically, entirely without consulting anyone, formed an extremely clear opinion on the matter of her own future. "Peter says you have an extra room," she informed James directly, hands planted firmly on her hips, having cornered the Alpha King of Drakenholt in his own hallway with the fearless directness of a 6-year-old executing a plan she had clearly rehearsed. "And he says you're good at being a papa now, since he taught you everything. So you should probably have 2 children instead of 1, because I am an excellent big sister in training, and Peter needs the practice of having someone smaller than him to boss around, since right now he only has you and Papa Elias to boss around, and that's not the same at all." James, who had negotiated border treaties with visiting delegations with considerably more composure than he could currently muster, simply stared down at her, entirely, helplessly outmatched. "I don't have parents that count," Marta added, with the brisk, unsentimental practicality of a child who had already done the difficult arithmetic of her own situation and made peace with the sum. "My aunt loves me, I know she does, but she has 6 mouths to feed already, and I'm the 7th. And 7 is 1 too many for what she has to give. I think you should adopt me. I already know how to behave at a castle. I've been practicing my curtsy in the kitchen mirror for a month. Ask anyone." That evening, James relayed the entire conversation to Elias, with the dazed, faintly winded expression of a man who had just been thoroughly out-negotiated by a child not yet up to his hip. "She's not wrong, you know," Elias said, laughing until he had to wipe his eyes on his sleeve. "About Peter needing someone to boss around, and about you being good at this now. 4 months ago, you couldn't sit on a floor without complaining about your dignity, and now you're being recruited by 6-year-olds. I have never once complained about my dignity." "You complained about the cabbage for a solid year, James. That," James said with immense wounded gravity, "was a different kind of dignity." Marta moved into the castle 2 weeks later, having packed her own belongings herself into a single worn satchel, with the brisk efficiency of a woman 20 times her age, and inspected her new room with the critical, appraising eye of someone evaluating a business venture rather than a bedroom, testing the mattress with both hands, opening and closing the wardrobe door twice, checking the window latch, before pronouncing it, with the same relentless practicality, "Acceptable for now, though the curtains are a bit much, and I'll want them changed by autumn." Peter took to being an older brother with the fierce, protective devotion of a boy who understood, better than most 7-year-olds ever have cause to, exactly how much it mattered to have someone unconditionally in your corner. He showed her every hiding spot in the castle within her first week: the gap behind the tapestry in the East Hall, the low shelf in the library where a person could disappear entirely, the exact bench in the kitchen garden where the cook never thought to look for missing scones. Marta, for her part, took to being a younger sister by immediately appointing herself in charge of both her new father's schedules, informing James with total, unblinking seriousness that he was working too much and smiling too little, which Papa Elias says used to be a problem before I got here, so I'm fixing it. You're welcome. "I don't recall agreeing to a household manager," James told Elias one evening, watching 6-year-old Marta reorganize the correspondence on his desk by what she had personally decided was order of importance. A system that placed her own crayon drawings of the family, unmistakably, above 3 separate trade agreements and a letter from the Bavarian delegation. "You didn't," Elias said, not looking up from his own reading. "She simply decided, and now it's decided. I find I'm growing rather used to that in this family. It's practically our house motto by now. Someone decides, and the rest of us catch up." Astrid, Dowager Queen, and once the sharpest tongue in any council chamber in Drachenholt, had softened over the years in ways that surprised absolutely everyone, except perhaps Elias, who had long privately suspected that beneath the ledgers and the icy composure lived a woman who had simply never before been given anything worth softening for. Peter and Marta gave her exactly that, and gave it to her all at once, with no patience whatsoever for half-measures. The formal court presentation, necessary, James had explained apologetically over breakfast, purely for the political record, so that no visiting delegation could later question the children's rightful place in the family, or worse, use their uncertain status as leverage the way Kessler once had, was meant to be a brief, dignified affair, 20 minutes at most, a formal declaration before the assembled council and a handful of allied delegates. It lasted considerably longer than planned, and it was, by unanimous and lasting agreement among everyone present, infinitely better for it. It began reasonably enough, Astrid opening the proceedings with practiced formality, James standing beside Elias with a hand resting warm at the small of his husband's back, both children dressed in small, matching versions of the royal black and silver that Marta had inspected that morning, with the same critical eye she'd given her bedroom curtains, and declared, grudgingly, "Acceptable, I suppose, though I'd have added more silver." It went entirely off the rails, the moment Marta decided the ceremony required more thoroughness than anyone had planned for. She insisted on curtsying to every single member of the Alliance Council individually, in strict order of what she had personally determined, through some private calculus of her own, was their relative importance. The Bavarian delegate first, for reasons she never fully explained, followed by Conrad, because he's family even if he's not blood, and only then the actual ranking nobles, several of whom looked faintly scandalized, and several more of whom looked, to Elias's private delight, thoroughly charmed. Peter, not to be outdone, had smuggled in 3 separate questions about wolves that he insisted, with the solemn gravity of a boy raising matters of state, on asking the visiting Bavarian delegate mid-ceremony, apparently under the impression that a foreign dignitary might have information his own fathers had somehow overlooked. "Grandmother," Marta announced to Astrid, entirely unprompted, partway through the formal proceedings, cutting cleanly through a delegate's half-finished sentence with the unbothered confidence of a child who had never once considered that a room might not be listening to her. "Papa James says you used to be very fierce, and everyone was afraid of you. I think that's an excellent quality in a woman, and I would like lessons." The council chamber, for the second time in its long history, though only Elias and James knew that, went entirely, breathlessly silent around a moment engineered by someone with absolutely no business being that composed at 6 years old. Astrid, to the astonishment of every single person present, laughed, a real laugh, rusty with disuse, rising up out of her with a surprise that seemed to catch even herself off guard. The kind of laugh James hadn't heard from his mother since before his father died, a sound the whole hall seemed to lean toward like plants toward sun. "Lessons," Astrid repeated, delighted, dabbing at one eye with a gloved finger. "Yes, I believe I can manage that, little one. Come sit beside me, and I will teach you the very first rule of being formidable. Never, under any circumstances, let them see you flinch." "I never flinch," Marta said solemnly, already climbing into the offered seat beside the Dowager Queen, with the easy confidence of a girl who had, somehow, already decided this outcome was inevitable. "Papa Elias says I get that from being stubborn as a mule." "An excellent foundation," Astrid said warmly, "for absolutely everything worth doing." And from that day forward, the Dowager Queen's afternoons were rarely complete without a small, fierce girl perched at her elbow, learning the art of being unshakable from the one woman in the kingdom who had once upon a time tried her level best to talk her son out of exactly the family now standing so proudly, so improbably, before the whole assembled court. Peter, for his part, got through all 3 of his wolf questions, much to the visible relief of the Bavarian delegate, who answered each with careful diplomatic patience, despite having, by his own later admission to Conrad, absolutely no expertise whatsoever on the sleeping habits of shapeshifters, was gently informed by James afterward that treaty ceremonies were perhaps not the ideal venue for a full inquiry into lupine sleep habits, and immediately began compiling, with visible determination, a longer and more thorough list for next time. Winters came and went, the way they always do, gentle over Drakenholt's old towers, and the small workroom that had once held nothing but a heartbroken king, and a single jar of yarrow salve grew, over the years, considerably more crowded, with a boy who'd once eaten raw cabbage purely out of fear, and now stole cooked ones purely out of habit, grinning whenever caught. With a girl who ran the household with ruthless 6-year-old efficiency, and would, everyone privately agreed, likely run the kingdom itself one day rather well, given the chance. With a grandmother who had finally learned that fierce and soft were never truly opposites at all, but 2 edges of the very same blade, and with 2 men who had built, out of one overheard misunderstanding and one very long chase through the rain, something neither of them had quite dared to hope for, on the night a herb boy first hid in a wardrobe. On one particular evening, some years into all of it, Elias found the whole family exactly where he'd have expected to find them if asked. James sprawled entirely undignified on the workroom floor, an alpha king of Drakenholt, letting Peter braid what remained of his patience into his own silver hair, while Marta narrated the entire proceedings with theatrical seriousness to an audience of one increasingly unimpressed castle cat, who had long since resigned itself to a life of being talked at. "You look ridiculous," Elias informed his husband from the doorway, the same fond exasperation in his voice he'd once aimed at a man losing a very public war against a cabbage. "I look loved," James corrected, wincing gamely as Peter tugged a knot considerably tighter than strictly necessary. "There's a meaningful difference, and I'll remind you that you married me for both, in roughly equal measure, if I recall the vows correctly." "He did," Peter confirmed solemnly, still braiding with the fierce concentration of a boy who took his responsibilities seriously. "Papa Elias told me the whole story, about the wardrobe, and the running away and the cabbage war. I think it's the best story I've ever heard in my whole entire life." "Better than the wolves?" Marta demanded, scandalized on principle, hands flying to her hips in a gesture so precisely her father's that Elias had to bite back a laugh. "The story has wolves in it, Marta. Weren't you listening at all?" Elias crossed the room and settled onto the floor beside his family. His husband, hair thoroughly and cheerfully ruined. His son, narrating his own version of a love story he'd inherited rather than lived through, but had somehow made entirely his own. His daughter already plotting, quite visibly, her next campaign of household reorganization, and felt the same warm, unshakable certainty settle over him that had first found him on a bridge in Lindenau, years and years before, when a man he loved had slid a plain silver ring onto his hand and promised him an ordinary, extraordinary life. Outside the workroom window, the river ran on exactly as it always had, patient and unhurried, carrying the seasons past Drakenholt one after another, and inside, in a room that smelled of yarrow and pine, and very faintly, of cooked cabbage, a family that had been built rather than born sat tangled together on the floor, entirely unbothered by dignity, entirely, wholly certain of one another. "Tell the wardrobe part again," Peter said, finally abandoning the braid at last, to lean his whole weight, trusting and warm, against James's shoulder. "The part where you hid behind the coats and Papa James found you, and you had lavender stuck to your collar. Again?" James laughed, tipping his head back against the workbench leg. "You've heard that part 11 times, Peter, by my own count. It's a good story," Peter said simply, with the unshakable, uncomplicated logic of a child who had learned, better than most grown men ever manage, that the very best stories are the ones worth hearing again and again in exactly the same words, until they've become something closer to a prayer than a memory. "Tell it again, please." And so, with his whole family gathered close around him on an ordinary workroom floor, on an ordinary evening that felt, as all their best evenings somehow did, entirely extraordinary, Elias began the story once more, from the very beginning, the wardrobe, the lavender, the wolf with eyes like caught sunlight, and outside the snow began, quiet and certain, to fall over Drakenholt, over the river, over a family that had started, once, with nothing but a misunderstanding and a very long chase and had grown, slowly and patiently and entirely on purpose, into everything.